All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of New Agreements. Today, I am really excited to be joined with Bas, who I met a few weeks ago. Thanks, Bas, for joining me on today's conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
We were connected by a friend, having a very interesting and broad-ranging conversation, but the bit that led us to today was one part of the conversation where you touched on a way of viewing crypto, a way of viewing Bitcoin more specifically, that for me was like, whoa, I think you might have just changed my whole view in a couple of minutes of explanation. And I was like, let's do a whole chat and record it so others can listen and see what they think as well. It's very seldom that somebody comes along with a different paradigm almost of thinking, and I seem quite convinced by it after just a few minutes. So that is what we're going to explore today, which is whether or not Bitcoin is the best thing for our renewable aspirations or the worst possible thing. Maybe two things to explain to everybody listening before we get going today. Firstly is why we're just going to call you Bas today, why it's not going to be the normal personal exploration that I do enjoy to go on with guests that are on my podcast. And we'll come on to that. But secondly, just to provide the context, you know, I've created with friends a cryptocurrency backed by trees on the Telos network. And we specifically chose the Telos network because it's a proof of stake system, not a proof of work system. And the proof of work system being one that is quite energy intensive, if not very energy intensive, and been written up as similar to taking the same amount of energy as countries. Whereas a proof of stake system, less complex, less computers needing agreement, and therefore much less energy intensive. And so I was of the belief that these systems were the sustainable and ecologically friendly way forward. And that is the context I was coming into our conversation. And before we get on to the argument as you laid it out before, why do you think it's important not to do backstory, not to talk about the person too much in these kinds of contexts?
Thank you for that question. I think in this discussion, personal opinions and the person quite often gets convoluted with the actual argument being made. And I think it should be independent of the person making the argument. And it is really important for people to just follow the logic and being able to question it themselves modularly. Just having a personal backstory about where I come from, why I think the way I think, actually doesn't add to the argument that I think is so important to have out there for people to at least be able to hear.
I understand that indeed, and it can convolute things and add layers of complexity and bias. So without further ado, let's get straight into, I mean, is it fair to represent it in the way of saying you think that Bitcoin is possibly the best incentive that's ever been created to help lead us as quickly as possible to a renewable future? Is that fair to say? Or would you like to start it from a different position?
No, I think you're spot on there, Dave.
And so will you guide us a little bit through to the steps in the journey that might lead us to agree or disagree with the position you're coming from?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important in here to not start somewhere in the middle of the argument, but to really start at the origins. We are talking about energy. We are talking about a renewable energy future. So let's start with some assumptions that I think we will be able to make. So I'm also going to ask some questions back, if you don't mind.
Great. Good.
Wonderful. I think that one of the main key drivers of progress in the past has been the increase of productive energy output. So question to you is like, would you rather live in a society who can just make use of wood to make fire? Or would you want to live in one who can also make use of the energy that coal contains?
Well, after living in the woods for a year, I can tell you that if we had to just chop the trees and dry the trees and burn the trees, one, there would be a lot more emissions in the sky, and two, I wouldn't have much time for anything else. So although it's cathartic and therapeutic and enjoyable to get back to that base reality, no, I am very pleased that we get to harness other energy sources. And I do agree that our ability to progress and specialize and lift ourselves essentially out of poverty is directly linked to how much energy we can sort of harness.
I agree. full-heartedly. And we obviously first, tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago, were able to actually harness the power of burning wood and make sure that we can properly harness the power of fire it provides. We have been able to harness the power of coal quite efficiently. We've done the same for oil and for gas, and the same for hydropower, for wind power, and much more recently, the power of the sun as well, solar power. And I think that it is quite safe to say that that progression has been wonderful and tremendous for our progress and continues to be. And especially the progression towards these lastly named renewable sources like hydro, wind, and especially solar are incredible for the progress that we can make as human civilization.
I mean, obviously, with the caveat, if I may, as you say, the former will run out and, are altering our carbon budgets.
Absolutely. Ideally, of course, we would try and get to harness the power of our sun instead of trying to harness the power of fossil fuels. I'm glad that we agree on that one.
Definitely.
The next one I would like to touch upon is, I think that right now it is more important to focus on our means of energy production than it is to just focus on our means of energy consumption. The reason why I think that is because if you make sure that energy is produced sustainably, and that is the only type, or at the very least main type of energy that is produced, then that is the energy that can be consumed. If we can focus our efforts on making sure that energy production becomes sustainable, then what will follow is a sustainable consumption of energy.
Whereas most of the argument is about our carbon footprint and our energy consumption, but not looking at the creative side of that argument. Is this what you mean?
Exactly. A lot of our efforts have always also been in the reduction of our consumption of carbon-intensive energy sources. To focus more on production will lead us faster to a renewable energy future. I do think that incentive structures in that matter. If you can incentivize renewable energy production and of course also consumption, that is the prime incentive over the consumption and production of fossil fuels, then probably you will go and gravitate towards a renewable future. Now, there is a couple of ways to make sure that you have these incentive structures in place. A very powerful incentive is a monetary incentive. If we can make it more profitable to have renewable energy sources, people will gravitate towards renewable energy sources.
To what extent do you think it's helpful or a hindrance to talk about where we are today on that journey?
It's a tricky one. Right now, the cheapest form of energy that we can produce right now in many places is already solar energy. And is in many places already wind energy. So renewable sources are already cheaper in production in many places than fossil fuels to harness that energy. What is tricky with renewable sources is that they are fluctuating in their output. You can only produce wind energy when there is wind, and solar when there is solar. You can store coal really easily. It is a store of energy. So you can instantly fire it up. The same, of course, goes for nuclear, which I think is a very specific topic that we could also dive into as well, which could be a wonderful baseload for our grid. It is not necessarily that the incentives for renewable energy aren't there, because the monetary incentives are already there. And that's why you also see this Cambrian explosion almost of renewable energy sources, especially in many countries in the West.
The price of production of renewables is already competitive, if not favorable, but its method of delivery and dissemination is spiky and less consistent and dependable than the fossilized stores of energy. And therefore, it's in a gray area at the moment. There's some desirable attributes of the non-renewable side and some desirable attributes of the renewable side. And thus, incentives in that gray area become really important.
Exactly. And of course, in some places, it is more profitable to put a windmill or a solar farm than it is in others. In places with a lot of sun, it's more profitable to have a solar farm. In places with a lot of wind, it's more profitable to have a wind farm. It is not just enough that it is already in many places more profitable than burning fossil fuels for energy production. We need to make it as profitable as it can possibly be, because if we can make it even more profitable, what that means is that in places where there is some wind or some solar, whereas that now is not profitable to put a solar farm or a wind farm there, if we make it even more profitable, the energy production of renewables, then suddenly it becomes profitable to build even more solar farms and wind farms. So even if it is already more profitable in many cases to have renewable energy sources than fossil fuel energy sources, it is still incredibly important that we can make it even more profitable to make sure that in more places we can harness that energy in an economically viable way.
Agreed.
If we are agreed on that, then we can actually dive a little bit more into Bitcoin. What's really important to understand is that right now, Bitcoin mining is already one of the most sustainable industries in the world. The best estimate we have right now, as by the Bitcoin Mining Council, is approximately 57% of all energy that Bitcoin consumes comes from renewable sources. That's massive, especially if you consider that in the US, it is approximately 25-30% of all energy comes from renewable sources. If you look at another massive economy like China, it's like 15% coming from renewable sources. What that means with Bitcoin's 56%, let's say, is that it is greener than the grid. If you plug in your electric car simply in a power plug in the grid, approximately 30% of that energy that goes into your car battery is renewable. The other 70% won't be. Now, with Bitcoin mining, that's 56%. And if I'm not mistaken, that doesn't even include stranded energy from fossil fuel sources that we'll get later into probably as well.
And the question is, how is that physically happening? You know, I could make some assumptions, but how are they achieving that double, that 30% difference from the standard grid?
First, it's really important to understand, I think, for people listening to this, that not all renewable energy consumers are equal. If one does simply take away renewable energy consumption from another consumer who would also otherwise have consumed that renewable energy source, then you are replacing another consumer of renewable energy. You might make it a bit more profitable because there might be a higher demand for renewable energy, but it is marginal. You're just replacing one customer with the other.
Low additionality is how I would call it.
It's low additionality. Now, if you do not take away from potentially another consumer of that renewable energy, but you simply consume energy that would otherwise not be consumed, I think we can both agree, if that's a renewable source, that is way more beneficial to the advancement of renewable energy sources than just replacing another customer.
Because the value was being zero captured, it was being entirely lost, and whatever you're using that for, if you're able to capture it, whatever you're using it for, if it's productive to any degree, it's going to have significant additionality, therefore pumping more money naturally into the renewable economy because you're capturing more of the value that was being harnessed or created than before.
You are spot on, Dave. So that has been very tricky up until now to actually do that because of peak production in especially solar and wind sources, which has been incredibly tricky to harness. There is only so much power that the grid can handle in the first place, and also that consumers want at a given moment in time.
And this is the spikiness we talked about before. It comes and it goes based on the wind and the sun, and we're redundant to the biosphere, and we can't store it very well, right?
Exactly. Storage is a massive problem right now. We do not have proper sources to properly store energy, location independent, to make sure that we can actually make use of that lost economic potential. Because right now, if you have a wind farm or a solar farm and you're a developer, the peak energy production is not something you can count in your economic calculation. Because more often than not, you will not be able to deliver that energy to the grid. It is lost economic potential. With Bitcoin mining specifically, you can actually capture all of that energy production, especially when there is peak supply and not as much demand. You can simply set a Bitcoin miner on a renewable energy source, make sure you consume that otherwise lost energy, lost economic potential for that solar farm, for that wind farm, and you actually put it into, in this case, a money. You can transfer it into a Bitcoin, so to say, and probabilistically into Bitcoins. And that is direct economic potential that you generate from otherwise lost energy.
It's as if you have a windmill, everybody's using the energy they want to use, and instead of the energy just dissipating, it's like you're producing gold bars right there on site and then storing them on site, except the gold bars are the Bitcoins in this case. Is this a concept you're describing, or are there examples where people literally stick mining servers in the wind turbine HQs and actually do this? And the second part of that question is, I've heard about people sending surplus energy uphill to move dams and then gravity store the energy. And then when they want it, they kind of release the dam and it lets the water flow, and that creates hydro as a kind of complement. Is it real, what you're talking about? And is it better than an old school solution like powering a dam?
That's a great question to ask. The key differentiator here, in my opinion, is the location independent nature of Bitcoin mining. In order to make sure that you pump water upwards into, let's say, store it into a lake and build a dam, except for like the massive infrastructure investment that is needed, by the way, to make sure that you can make that happen, you are also dependent upon a significant change in elevation that you can make use of. And if you do not have that, a plateau right there, quite next to where the energy otherwise would have been produced, then you cannot do so. That doesn't mean that like simply using the power of gravity through water in this case isn't an amazing battery, so to say. It absolutely is. I'm not arguing that Bitcoin is going to replace that. I think it is amazing, and we should have a very diversified use of different types of batteries, so to say, to make our grid and our energy production more sustainable and more viable in the end as well. The reason why Bitcoin mining in this case is additional, very much so, to, for example, things like having a water gravity storage battery is because you cannot do that everywhere. I am myself originally from the Netherlands. Good luck doing that in one of the flattest countries on earth. Right?
If we were to assume, for the purpose of this conversation, that the value capture ability of Bitcoin mining were comparable to that of a hydro battery solution, all we're basically saying is that this opens up that incentive to anybody who's not next to a kind of a natural battery solution to give them the same opportunity, which democratizes the ability for anyone anywhere to sort of invest in renewable energy sources, infrastructure that they might not otherwise have had the economic means to do. The only difference being, instead of that economic store of value being a local one, it's actually, as you say, a location independent one. Depending on your geopolitical persuasions, there are pros and cons to what kind of economy you're feeding by investing in the Bitcoin, but that is for another conversation also. Combining the Bitcoin store of value with renewable allows to yin and yang support the spiky nature of energy production from renewable sources.
Exactly. Bitcoin incentivizes the consumption of stranded energy energy that is otherwise wasted has lost economic potential. Now, stranded energy, first and foremost, is very prevalent in our renewable energy sector. Stranded energy is a massive problem with regards to wind and solar.
Mm-hmm.
Stranded energy is also massive with regards to, especially in certain parts of the United States, with regards to oil wells, which do a lot of methane flaring, quite literally just flaring methane, a byproduct of the oil production and gas production, in flaring it simply into our atmosphere. Methane has more energy potential, way more so, than CO2. Methane is also way more harmful, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Simply, it also has more energy potential. And what some Bitcoin miners are doing right now is actually making sure that they harness that methane on the spot and making sure that they convert it to less harmful CO2, and the energy captured is used for mining Bitcoin, which is massive. Is this right now reality? Is it used with regards to the way that I am saying it can be used? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. One of the most beautiful examples that I know of right now is what is happening in Texas, especially West Texas, which is one of the parts of the United States specifically with most renewable energy potential, wind as well as solar. Now, Bitcoin miners are already flocking there to make sure that they can make use of the stranded energy, which is beneficial not just for the Bitcoin miners and not just to the developers of renewable energy, which now have more value for their means of production, but also to stabilizing the grid, which right now, if we're talking about renewable energy future, one of the massive bottlenecks, if not the biggest bottleneck, is that our grid can simply not handle the increase in capacity. This massive increase in demand for electricity cannot be handled properly by our current grid. And Bitcoin mining itself makes sure that you can harness economic potential from energy production without making use of the grid, because you are doing that on site, which makes sure that you can, again, have more economic potential, harness economic potential from renewable energy production without grid overload, which is massive right now, since that's one of the major bottlenecks. More important, I think personally, and I think we'll agree on this, than on the scale on which it happens right now, is the trend line, right? Where is it going? Where was it a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? Where is it now? It's overwhelmingly exponential. The increase in which Bitcoin mining is used to capture and harness stranded energy from renewable means of production. You can also simply see that in how much more renewable the Bitcoin mining ecosystem is becoming over the years. It is simply up and to the right with regards to renewable energy percentage as a part of the network. What if we actually need that renewable energy for other activities, let's say essential services, other than mining Bitcoin, in cases in which we have a lack, a shortage of energy? Well, the beauty with Bitcoin mining is that you can actually turn them off. And the contracts that are being made between Bitcoin miners and renewable energy producers, and also states, in this case, for example, the state of Texas and counties in general, is simply that in times of dire need, that Bitcoin miners will be turned off. And that's simply switch of a button, and you can do that. The Bitcoin miners do not need to get their energy from the grid, right? They can be grid independent, and they mostly are making sure that they have long-lasting multi-year contracts with renewable energy producers in which they agree to simply consume a certain amount of energy that is produced, which is incredibly powerful for renewable energy producers. And why? Because right now they are always handled as the fluctuating supply with regards to actual production, and therefore also economic value. They are not the base load what the grid can rely upon. So how much economic value they actually get from their renewable sources is really dependent on whether the peak in production of solar and wind is also at the right time where peak of consumption is also coming in. If that is not very much so aligned, then those renewable energy producers really have a problem from an economic perspective. Now, Bitcoin miners really don't care when that energy is produced. They'll consume it 24/7, 365. Just give it to them whenever it's available. Which is incredibly powerful of its own.
The key element, I think, that's paradigm switching here is, instead of this being a consumption conversation, it's a production conversation. And you're basically saying everything after production is downstream. The consumption is downstream. It will all follow. The key is getting the production as highly incentivized as possible. Would you say there is no better way to incentivize the production of renewable energy than the incentives that Bitcoin specifically offers?
There is no other industry which provides such massive new economic potential to renewable energy sources, location independent, to be switched, turned on and off on demand, than Bitcoin mining. Absolutely. The key to making sure that we accelerate into a renewable future is to make sure that we can make it as profitable as possible for renewable energy sources to be developed anywhere.
Yes. And I was thinking, actually, when you said about the miners being able to purchase long-term contracts with new renewable energy providers in advance, there is no better way of developing a business than the business having long-term signed customer contracts that they can go and leverage investment and debt and other forms of growth mechanisms for their operations. So this is a very helpful vehicle in which to be able to commit to.
If we have incentives that work towards a accelerated renewable future, that doesn't mean that Bitcoin is carbon neutral, right? Of course it's not. Like 56%, not 100, not yet. And we are really talking about what people value here. If you see no value in something, then any ounce, any gram of carbon that is emitted by it is too much, right? If you see no value in it, then you can be 99% sustainable and people will be complaining about the other 1%.
Correct.
So then it's essentially a value discussion. And I do think personally that it is incredibly tricky, and honestly, for the people making it, quite a horrible, in a sense, argument to try and argue from a value-based discussion. It is incredibly tricky to dictate for other people what is deemed valuable, what is allowed to be valuable. That is completely contrary to trying to have a free market and let people decide for themselves. And it really touches upon some of the founding characteristics of most, especially Western democracies. And I really don't think we should go there. We should make sure that people can decide for themselves what they deem valuable. To touch upon that in a different way, though, I do think that there might be a significant role for governance with regards to incentive engineering. Now, another way of calling incentive engineering is pretty much taxation. That's what we call taxation, right? Governments could simply make sure that Bitcoin mining, which uses stranded and renewable energy sources, is not as much taxed as Bitcoin mining that uses fossil fuel energy sources. Incentive engineering is still a real thing, and that might actually be a very good thing to do. Incentivize renewable energy production and stranded energy consumption for economic purposes. And governments could really come in handy there to make sure that we even accelerate more that transition towards a renewable energy future. And to be clear, like, I'm talking about acceleration. because also without these government incentives, Bitcoin is already doing that without any subsidies, without any government support, nothing whatsoever. It is working towards it. But if governments would be helpful, we could even accelerate that more.
Just to come back to a couple of important points here. I know you said let's not have a discussion about values, but I think even in the beginning of this conversation, when we began to get some premises agreed, you were naturally doing the work of drawing attention to the fact that energy production is a good thing, and that we're in a place where that energy production needs to be renewable. So I do think naturally our agreed values in this conversation were the predicates for the conversation that we are now beginning to discuss layers on top of that. So I don't think it's absent of values, this conversation, but I think it's easy to agree upon them unless you want to live in a hut in the woods and not be a part of modern society. Then somebody could argue something different. But I think most of us would easily agree with those first premise.
To maybe add on that, I do agree. This conversation is, of course, not absent of values. I want to make sure that the values that we do discuss are very much the focus on Bitcoin from a renewable energy perspective. That is the key takeaway there. And the definition of what, to come back to the first part of our conversation, the definition of what we define as progress. Well, that can, to a certain extent, of course, be a very subjective thing. Just like you said, if you want everyone to go back to being a hunter-gatherer and providing for themselves in small groups of maximum 150 people, and you think we should go back to that, then maybe Bitcoin is not the best solution for you. If you have a definition of progress which is more aligned to what we define right now, then I think we're really on the right path.
Yeah. Exactly. And I enjoy these Zoom calls too much to only be a hunter-gatherer in the woods, you see. So I'm kind of beginning to extrapolate general principles from what I'm hearing you describe in what would seem some kind of archetypal incentive plan for a renewable future through Bitcoin, which is to ask ourselves the question of any system. We could ask, is this a system which incentivizes an accelerated and additional renewable future? Or is it not providing additionality? Or worse still, is it incentivizing a non-renewable future? You know, I think this is the question we could ask of any system. From my set of values and my standpoint, it may well be the valuable question to ask of any system, whether that be a country, a company, a personal lifestyle, a new economic store of value, anything like that. Do you think this is fair to say we're looking for what incentives does the system generate? And does it point towards renewable life? And is it offering some form of additionality?
Absolutely. I think you're spot on there, Dave. It's a really valid question to ask for any system. I think we should do that, not just for Bitcoin, which is getting a lot of the spotlight, but also ask that for the system in which we operate right now. And you might come to some very harsh conclusions on that as well, with regards to our current financial incentives and our current economic system, and how that does or does not incentivize a renewable future, especially if you compare it to Bitcoin. Maybe to add to that, you already touched upon it with regards to the trickle-down effect that you have when you do really focus on where supply chains begin. And I want to emphasize that even more, that it is not just the energy supply chain that I am targeting here. It is the core, the beginning of pretty much every supply chain, not just the energy sector, because we need energy for almost all industries that we have and make use of day to day, all the products, all the services we consume in our day-to-day. We need energy first and foremost. Energy is the core energy production, not just of the energy sector, but it has a trickle-down effect to all other industries as well. And I really want to make that point across.
In our conversations, I've realized that my biases towards or against Bitcoin are actually speaking to something far broader around the geopolitical landscape and energy production. And if I were to believe, which I think I now do, that actually it is not something to be feared. The consumption of energy in the Bitcoin network is not something to be feared, because the story it is incentivizing and providing additionality towards is the very underpinnings of the economy and energy production that we want and need for the future that we desire. If I truly embrace that, then my whole view and outlook on the proxy of the price of Bitcoin being one that maybe speaks to the production of incentivization of energy is totally different to my old view that saw it as something potentially extractive in nature, and ultimately very different to the oil-based economies that we've been used to with fiat economies that were gold and then oil backed, essentially. I'm not trying to get into that realm, but it would be amiss not to touch on the depth of the importance of our bias one way or another on this subject.
Absolutely, and I think from my end to summarize that without going too much into detail on the specifics is, right now indeed we as a global economy rely on a petrodollar system, pretty much like explicit, not even implicitly but explicitly, world economy backed by the peg between like the dollar and oil and oil production. That was to as at least some extent very useful in an era in which most economic activity came from the means of production of oil, physically based as well. Mm-hmm. And right now, most of our economic activity comes from the digital realm, from electric energy, electricity. Mm-hmm. Yet we are still basing our entire global economy on a peg between the US dollar in this case and means of oil, fossil fuel production. Wouldn't it be way more sensical, logical to, whether that is Bitcoin or anything else, to make sure that we peg our world economy to the means of energy production that we want for our modern economy and for our future, which in this case is from electricity, and especially stranded and renewable energy sources. Mm-hmm. Incentivizing a system that incentivizes that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think our last conversation was 2 or 3 hours long and a wonderful meandering journey, which we won't do to the viewers and listeners today, but rather to try to wrap up there, because I think we've covered a lot of ground, from the fundamental agreements about what has been good to help us develop, where we are now, what the incentives are, and what the values of good systems might be, of which a listener or a viewer can determine whether or not they think that Bitcoin is a good system to be supported on those bases. I, for one, am interested to continue to have conversations with people who listen to this, who may have other details, thoughts, questions, but hopefully we've managed to present something, I mean, predominantly yourself, presenting something here that is without the weeds and the details that normally mean we get lost. We've put a few markers in for future conversations, but hopefully the key argument can be seen.
I think every single point made in this argument, and also like assumptions that were made explicit in this line of argument, I really encourage for people to think about that themselves, to ponder on it themselves, to make sure that they are very aware of their own bias as well, and that they, at the very least, especially if they are not very inclined to agree with my line of argumentation, which is fair, to give it a fair shot.
Yes.
And that is most important. For Bitcoin miners specifically, there is a lot of misconceptions out there as well, because one of the biggest misconceptions out there is that they would become redundant quite quickly, and that they have a very small lifespan, which is not the case for modern ASICs. A really easy search will immediately reveal that the average lifespan of a modern Bitcoin miner is very easily 5 years, and if used properly in the right conditions, even up to 10 years. Now, Bitcoin only exists since 2009, and large-scale Bitcoin mining didn't really take off until 2013. There is Bitcoin miners that are right now in use, that are still profitable, that were made when it was first being made on a massive scale, that Bitcoin mining was being done on a commercial massive scale. Well, that's huge, first and foremost. These are still being used. And why and how is that the case? And without getting too technical here, Bitcoin, like your capacity to actually mine Bitcoin, your probability of mining it is based on your share of hash power in the network.
Mm-hmm.
It's probabilistic. So if you have a very old miner that doesn't have as much hash power as some of the new miners, then yes, probabilistically that miner's economic potential is much less than it has been, but it is far from zero. Especially since it can make use of otherwise stranded energy sources. Especially those older miners are quite often used as otherwise stranded energy sources. So they're still economically viable, which is massive. And on top of that, right now, some very, people on the forefront from this industry are trying to make modular Bitcoin miners so that it becomes easier to also replace the functional defect aspects of them and to deconstruct them afterwards. So even make sure that we have a more renewable resource future instead of just renewable energy. Some notable ones for the people who are curious are Blockstream, led by Adam Back, who are trying to make use and develop modular Bitcoin mining structures, as well as Block, previously known as Square, led by Jack Dorsey, who is trying to do the same. And I'm sure there are others, there are more. I think that's really important to understand and to know that even there in the production, the resource intensity of Bitcoin mining equipment, that is trending towards a more renewable future. And that is seldom talked about, but I think is really important as well. Because even if we can finally only make use of renewable energy sources, somehow we are able to capture and store all energy that comes on our planet, or so to say, like civilization type 1 or the Kardashev scale. That'd be wonderful. But then still we might run out of those resources, right? And that might happen eventually either way. But at the very least, we owe it to ourselves to make sure that we do everything we can to delay that likely inevitability. And even there, noteworthy companies and individuals in this Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin sector in general are really thinking through to such a renewable resource future. I think that was really important to also touch upon.
No, definitely. And a very specific and technically helpful for some people that will be more engineering minded and that kind of thing. Thank you for doing that. Firstly, thank you so much, Bas, for taking us through that step by step, that journey of discovery of this argument. I guess my key for all the listeners is I hope that through listening to this, you can see that this isn't just a question about whether you like Bitcoin or not. And it's to try to see past some of the quick news article biases that emerge about its up and down value and those kinds of normal dialogues around Bitcoin, but to see that actually this is something that represents an example at the very heart of the modern structure of economy and society, and how we relate to it can be very important about how we choose to develop our lives over the next, I'm thinking about the next 30 years between being 35 and 65 and And so it's a really important thing to discuss, to think about, and be open-minded about. And I hope that people will listen to this and go and talk in pubs and workplaces and at home, and have a real conversation, seeing the different layers here, not just the practical ones, but the ones that it almost represents behind the conversation, if that makes sense to you, Bess.
Yeah, absolutely. I really hope so as well. And to maybe spark that, like an almost slogan type language, like I really am in Bitcoin for the climate. I really am. I care, and I do think that our climate emergency, given that you want humanity to flourish, is one of the most important problems that we have to solve right now as humanity. In not the like solely, there are some others like biodiversity, loss of that biodiversity, etc., which all go hand in hand. But it's one of the most important ones to solve, and I think it's really important to people to try and think of it like that, and at least give that line of argumentation a fair shot, because I do give every other line of argumentation a fair shot. And for a long time, I wanted to be convinced that I was wrong. And I really try and search still every day for ways in which I'm wrong. I fail to find a better line of argumentation based in truth and based in facts as much as possible than the one that I derive right now. And to give listeners a little bit of a cue on like who to maybe either like follow or try and like go to. Definitely some sources of inspiration for me have been Ross Stevens from NIDIC, leading the way for Bitcoin corporations, especially. Nic Carter, very involved with the Bitcoin energy debate. Please try and check him out. Jack Dorsey, who was leading Block and some very exciting initiatives with regards to modular Bitcoin mining, especially. Jeff Booth, which is a really interesting writer of pretty much how deflation is the key to a prosperous and abundant future. An interesting book, The Price of Tomorrow. But he is a very great advocate for Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining in general as well. Michael Saylor, who's the CEO of MicroStrategy and is very known for making massive Bitcoin purchases. He has some great podcasts that he brought out as well. And Balaji Srinivasan, which is for me a really interesting intellectual to try and follow and listen to. He has some interesting views, especially with regards to Bitcoin and how it can lead to a prosperous future for humanity. I think those are 6 individuals that could really help if you try and understand their line of argumentation as well. I want to make sure that that conversations like these do not lead to more polarization of especially the industry, but also not between people, but actually bring people closer together in conversation. And especially for people already interested in crypto in general, who might go like, well, Bitcoin is proof of work and proof of stake is way better, etc., etc. Why not do another incentive mechanism? Why not another consensus mechanism? I do think that there is value in other blockchains. I am not a massive Bitcoin maxi, so to say, in that regard, which I think is a very misused term, because I do think that Bitcoin could be a layer 0 for our financial system in a sense, and that there could be some very interesting layer 1s, of which notably Ethereum or Avalanche or Terra, or they have all other use cases. They're not competing with Bitcoin. There are other use cases, and they could be really valuable in their own right. So I encourage people to try and not seek polarization, but to try and see every project on its own merits and it's in its own right, and see what type of incentives that project brings in the space that it operates in.
And indeed, whether it offers any additionality as well on top of the incentives it offers. Bas, thank you so much. We're out of time today. I can't wait for our next conversation of one of 10 different things we could discuss, or all 10 at once. I really, really appreciate it. I've never heard anybody lay that idea out so nicely. And you've changed my position. I am now in the position, open-minded, obviously, until proven otherwise. I'm happy to now invest in Bitcoin with not necessarily money, but just with my own energy, my own eyes, my own conversation in a way that I wasn't before. So thank you for taking the time to help me to understand it through a different lens, and maybe some others as well. Hopefully we'll be speaking again online and offline.
Dave, thank you so much for having me.
No worries. See you guys again next time on New Agreements.